The confession. I've kept this secret for 30 years now, buried deep as a cottonmouth in winter mud. But secrets have a way of surfacing like thunder did that day in Redemption's swamp. They say time heals all wounds, but that ain't always true. Some wounds just scab over, waiting for the slightest touch to start bleeding again. I wasn't always this old man with trembling hands and regrets piled high as summer thunderclouds. Once I was Ranger Wyatt Calloway, respected throughout 3 counties for knowing the swamp better than my own reflection. But what happened that scorching July day in '93 changed everything I thought I knew about nature, loyalty, and the price of doing what's right. The snakes knew before any of us. They always do. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. Back in '93, I was 42 years old with shoulders broad as an oak trunk and not a single gray hair among the brown. 22 years I'd spent as a ranger at Redemption Swamp by then, following in my daddy's footsteps and his daddy's before him. The Callaways had been watching over that patch of wild Florida since before it had a proper name, back when it was just called that cursed bog south of Miller's Creek. Redemption Swamp wasn't just any wetland. The old-timers said it was where lost souls found their way during the Civil War. Runaway slaves, deserters, families fleeing the chaos. Something about that place held secrets, whispered in the rustling sawgrass, and reflected in the dark waters that could be glass-still one moment and churning with life the next. That summer was the worst drought in 50 years. The water level had dropped so low you could see old fence posts from farms long ago reclaimed by nature. Wildlife was concentrating around the remaining water holes, gators, deer, wild hogs, all setting aside their natural feuds out of desperation, but nothing compared to thunder. First time I laid eyes on that Brahman bull, I knew he was special. Standing near 7 feet at the shoulder with a silver-gray coat that seemed to catch every bit of sunlight, and eyes, Lord have mercy, eyes so intelligent they'd give you pause. He'd appeared in the preserve about 3 years prior, likely escaped from one of the ranches that went under during the economic downturn. Most wild cattle don't last long in the swamp, but Thunder wasn't most cattle. The locals had started telling stories about him, how he'd chase off gators threatening calves that weren't even his, how he seemed to know when storms were coming before even the weather service. Some of the more superstitious folks claimed he was the reincarnation of Old Man Jenkins, a hermit who'd lived in the swamp for 60 years and knew every inch of it. I didn't believe in such nonsense, but I respected that bull. We had a sort of understanding, Thunder and I. When our paths crossed during my patrols, he'd acknowledge me with a slow blink of those knowing eyes, and I'd tip my hat to him like he was just another ranger on duty. My wife Maggie used to tease me something fierce about it. "Wyatt Calloway," she'd say, "I swear you talk about that bull like he's your deputy." Perhaps she wasn't far wrong. In a place as wild and unpredictable as Redemption Swamp, you take your allies where you find them. None of us could have known then how important that unspoken alliance would become, or how it would be tested in the crucible of what was about to unfold. The morning it all began started like any other. I remember it was a Tuesday because Maggie had made biscuits and gravy, her Tuesday special. The heat had already settled in thick as molasses by 7 a.m., promising another scorcher. My radio crackled while I was finishing my coffee. "Wyatt, you copy?" It was Jennifer at dispatch, her voice tighter than usual. "Go ahead, Jen," I answered, already reaching for my hat. "Got a call from Pete Simmons. Says he spotted that big Brahman bull stuck in the East Marsh. And Wyatt," she hesitated, "he says there's snakes. Lots of them." My coffee went cold in my hand. East Marsh meant the deepest part of Redemption Swamp, where the ground could swallow a man whole if he didn't know exactly where to step. And snakes. July was when they were most active, most aggressive. "Tell Pete to stay clear. I'm heading out now." I kissed Maggie goodbye, not knowing it'd be nearly 3 days before I'd have the chance again. The preserve truck bumped along the service road, dust billowing behind me like a rusty cloud. I radioed Jed Harrington, our young reptile specialist fresh out of Florida State. If anyone could make sense of unusual snake behavior, it was Jed. "Multiple snakes around a trapped bull?" Jed's voice crackled through the radio. "That ain't natural, Wyatt. Eastern diamondbacks are solitary hunters. They don't gather like that unless—" "Unless what?" I pressed when he went quiet. "I don't know, but I'll meet you at East Creek Trailhead in 20. I made one more call to Ellie Whitman, our wildlife veterinarian. If Thunder was stuck, he'd need medical attention, and fast. The July sun could dehydrate a creature that size in hours. East Creek Trailhead was where civilization made its last stand before surrendering to Redemption Swamp proper. By the time I pulled up, Jed was already there, loading his snake hooks and tongs into a backpack. His red hair was stuffed under a sweat-stained cap, freckled face serious for once. "Mason's bringing the rescue gear," he said, not looking up from his preparations. "Said he'd be about 10 minutes behind me." Mason Abernathy was our equipment specialist. If anyone could figure out how to extract a 1-ton bull from marsh mud, it was him. I started gathering my own gear when Ellie's truck came bouncing down the trail, her medical kit already prepped on the passenger seat. "How bad?" she asked, foregoing any greeting. "Don't know yet. Pete's not one for exaggeration, though." The three of us set out, following the narrow trail that snaked into the heart of the swamp. The usual chorus of birds and insects seemed muted, as if the swamp itself was holding its breath. 20 minutes in, we heard the distant bellow of a bull in distress. "That's him," I said, picking up the pace. We rounded a bend in the trail, and there he was. Thunder, magnificent even in his predicament. He was sunk to his belly in black mud, head held high but with exhaustion clear in every line of his massive body. His silver-gray coat was streaked with mud and sweat, eyes rolling with fear and pain. But it was what surrounded him that stopped us cold. At least 30 eastern diamondback rattlesnakes formed a perimeter around Thunder, their distinctive diamond patterns catching the sunlight filtering through the cypress canopy. Instead of approaching the trapped bull, an easy meal for scavengers, they faced outward, as if standing guard. "Sweet Jesus," Jed whispered, instinctively stepping back. "In 20 years, studying reptiles, I ain't never seen nothing like this." Ellie clutched her medical bag tighter. "Is this some kind of territorial display?" Jed shook his head, bewildered. "Diamondbacks don't have territories, they defend collectively. This is something else." I raised my binoculars, scanning the scene. Thunder's eyes found mine, and I swear there was recognition there, maybe even relief. He gave a low moan, different from his earlier bellows, almost like he was trying to tell us something. "Look at how they're positioned," I said slowly. "They're not threatening Thunder. They're protecting him?" "From what?" Ellie asked. The answer came in the form of a slight movement in the palmetto thickets about 200 yards beyond Thunder. I adjusted my binoculars and felt my blood run cold. A man in camouflage was crouched there, rifle in hand, watching the scene with calculated patience. "We've got a poacher," I said, keeping my voice low. "Northeast quadrant, behind the palmettos." Jed and Ellie followed my gaze. The situation suddenly made a sick kind of sense. Thunder was valuable. His size alone would fetch a hefty price from certain collectors, not to mention his rare coloring. With the bull trapped and vulnerable, a poacher would have an easy shot, if not for the unexpected snake guardians. "We need to call this in," Ellie whispered. I nodded and reached for my radio when Mason's voice came from behind us, making us all jump. "Sorry I'm late," he said, arriving with 2 junior rangers carrying rescue equipment. "Traffic on the—" He stopped short at the site before us. Holy mother of... I quickly brought Mason up to speed while radioing Sheriff Hank Buchanan. If we were dealing with a poacher, we'd need law enforcement backup. Wyatt, you're breaking up, the sheriff's voice crackled through static. Say again about the poacher? Armed poacher at East Marsh, I repeated, louder this time. We've got a trapped bull and an unusual snake situation. Need backup ASAP. Copy that. Deputies, 20 minutes. The rest was lost to static. 20 minutes was too long. Thunder was weakening by the minute, and I had no idea how long those snakes would maintain their strange defensive formation. We need a plan, I said, gathering everyone in a tight circle. Mason, what options do we have for extraction? Mason scratched his beard, eyes never leaving the scene. With him sunk that deep, we'd normally need the winch truck, but no way we're getting that through these trails. We've got some portable pulleys and the inflatable lift bags, but even then... Could we build a platform? Ellie suggested. Something to distribute his weight once we start pulling him out? Maybe, Mason nodded, but those snakes are going to be a problem. All eyes turned to Jed, who was studying the reptiles with a mixture of fear and fascination. I've never seen diamondbacks behave this way, he repeated. It's like they're responding to something we can't perceive. But if we're going to help Thunder, we need to create a safe corridor. How do we do that without harming them? I asked. Diamondbacks were protected in the preserve, Jed thought for a moment. Temperature and vibration? They're highly sensitive to both. We could use heat lures to draw them in a specific direction, away from our approach path. It was a risk, but we had little choice. As Mason and the junior rangers began preparing the rescue equipment, Jed set up a series of special heat pads in a line leading away from our planned approach to Thunder. The waiting was excruciating. Thunder's breathing had become labored, his massive chest heaving with effort. The snakes remained vigilant, occasionally sending warning rattles toward the hidden poacher, who had barely moved from his position. Finally, Jed activated the heat lures. For a heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then slowly, like water finding a new channel, the snakes began to move. Not all at once, but enough to create a narrow corridor to Thunder. Now's our chance, I whispered. Ellie, you and I will approach first. Mason, have the equipment ready. Ellie nodded, her face set with determination. We began our cautious approach, stepping carefully where Jed indicated was safest. The remaining snakes watched us but didn't strike, almost as if they understood our intentions were different from the poachers. As we drew closer to Thunder, I could see the true extent of his predicament. The mud had him in a death grip, pulling him deeper with each struggle. His eyes, those intelligent eyes, fixed on me with what I can only describe as desperate trust. Easy, big fella, I murmured, reaching out slowly to touch his mud-caked shoulder. We're here to help. Thunder stilled at my touch, his breathing calming slightly. Ellie quickly checked his vitals, concern etching deeper lines in her face. He's severely dehydrated and exhausted, she said, preparing a saline drip. I can give him fluids and a mild stimulant, but we need to get him out fast, Wyatt. By now, Mason and the others had reached us, carefully laying out portable platforms around Thunder's trapped body. The plan was to build a stable base, then use the inflatable lift bags to create enough buoyancy to break the mud's suction, and finally pull him free with a system of ropes and pulleys. As we worked, I kept one eye on the palmetto thicket. The poacher hadn't moved, perhaps waiting for us to leave or for a clear shot. The snakes seemed to sense this too, maintaining their defensive perimeter despite Jed's heat lures. Whoever that is, Mason muttered, as we positioned the first lift bag. They're patient. That's not good. He was right. Amateur poachers get nervous, make mistakes. Patient ones were professionals. We had just started inflating the first lift bag when a sound stopped us cold, the distinctive metal click of a rifle being cocked, carried on the still swamp air. "Everybody down!" I shouted. We dropped to the mud as a shot rang out, the bullet striking a tree just above Thunder's head. The bull let out a terrified bellow, renewing his struggles and undoing much of our preparation work. The snakes reacted instantly, their collective rattling rising to a deafening crescendo as they oriented toward the shooter's position. Several began moving in that direction, forcing the poacher to retreat deeper into the thicket. "He's trying to scare us off," I realized aloud. "Wants us to leave Thunder vulnerable." "Well, he picked the wrong bunch to intimidate," Mason growled, already back to work on the lift bags. "My daddy didn't raise no coward." Despite the looming threat, we worked faster now, driven by determination and anger. Ellie's treatments were helping. Thunder's eyes were clearer, his breathing more regular. The first lift bag was fully inflated, creating a pocket of buoyancy under his right side. "Sheriff should be here any minute," one of the junior rangers said, checking his watch nervously. "We keep working," I ordered. "Thunder's our priority." The second lift bag was in place when I noticed movement in my peripheral vision, not from the palmetto thicket, but from the deeper swamp to our west. I turned just in time to see a figure slip between cypress trees, circling around to flank us. There was something about the way the figure moved, a familiarity that sent ice through my veins. I found myself hoping I was wrong, that the heat and stress were playing tricks on my mind. The third lift bag was inflating when Thunder suddenly tensed, his eyes fixed on something behind us. I turned just as a voice I knew all too well spoke from the shadows. "That's far enough, Wyatt." The figure stepped into a shaft of sunlight, and my worst fear was confirmed. Lucas Dawson, my former mentor, the previous conservation director, and the man who'd taught me everything I knew about Redemption Swamp, stood there holding a rifle trained steadily on our group. "Lucas?" I heard the disbelief in my own voice. "What in God's name are you doing?" His weathered face showed no emotion, but his eyes, once kind and wise, were cold as river stones in January. "Step away from the bull," he said quietly. "This doesn't concern you." But it did concern me, more than he could possibly know. I need to pause here, because what I'm about to tell you isn't easy. For 30 years I've carried this weight, like stones in my pockets, dragging me deeper every time I wade into the memories of that day. Lucas Dawson wasn't just my boss. He was the man who taught me everything worth knowing about rangering. When I was just 20 years old, wet behind the ears and green as spring palmetto, Lucas took me under his wing. "You've got the Callaway instinct," he'd told me. "Your daddy had it, and his daddy before him. You can read the swamp like other men read their morning paper." It was the highest praise I'd ever received. I remember the first time he took me deep into Redemption Swamp, to places even my daddy hadn't shown me. We'd hiked from sunrise until the light turned golden, Lucas pointing out things most folks would never notice. The slight discoloration on a cypress trunk marking an old water line, the way certain spiders only build webs on the northwest side of trees in fall. "The swamp speaks, Wyatt," he'd said in that gravelly voice. "Most folks just don't know how to listen." When my daddy passed from the cancer in '81, it was Lucas who showed up at our door with a casserole Mabel had made and a bottle of good bourbon. We sat on the porch until dawn, him telling stories about my daddy that even I hadn't heard, both of us laughing and crying by turns. "He was proud of you, son," Lucas had said, as the sun came up, prouder than he knew how to say. That's the man I thought I knew. The man standing before us now, rifle trained on people he'd once called friends, was a stranger wearing Lucas's face. "Lucas," I said again, trying to keep my voice steady, "put the rifle down. This isn't you." Something flickered in those cold eyes. Regret, maybe, or just irritation. "You don't understand what's at stake here, Wyatt," he replied. "That bull is worth more than you know." "Worth killing for?" Ellie challenged, her hands still pressed against Thunder's flank. The bull was watching Lucas with what looked remarkably like recognition. Lucas ignored her, his focus entirely on me. "How long have we known each other, Wyatt? 25 years? In all that time, have you ever known me to do anything without good reason?" Truth was, I hadn't. Lucas had always been methodical, principled. Even when I disagreed with his decisions, I could see the logic behind them. That's what made this moment so disorienting, like the ground beneath my feet had suddenly turned to quicksand. "Then help me understand," I said. "Because from where I'm standing, you're about to kill a protected animal in the preserve you spent your life defending." A muscle twitched in Lucas's jaw. "Sometimes sacrifice is necessary for the greater good. That's something your generation never understood." "Our generation?" Mason muttered. "You taught half of us everything we know." Lucas's eyes hardened. "And clearly I didn't teach you enough." Behind me I could feel the third lift bag reaching full inflation. We were almost ready to attempt extraction, but with Lucas holding us at gunpoint, we were trapped as surely as thunder in the mud. "What happened to you, Lucas?" I asked quietly. "Was it the retirement? The heart attack? Did something change, or was this who you always were and I just couldn't see it?" For a moment, just a flicker, I saw pain cross his weathered face. Then it was gone, replaced by steely resolve. "You think this is about money? About some trophy hunt?" He shook his head. "I gave 40 years to this preserve, Wyatt. 40 years watching politicians chip away at funding, developers drain the outskirts, polluters poison the waterways. 40 years of fighting a losing battle, and for what? So city folks can drive through once a year and take pictures from their air-conditioned cars?" I recognized the bitterness in his voice. I'd heard hints of it in recent years, but never this raw, never this consuming. "The system's broken," he continued. "Conservation isn't working, but there are people willing to pay millions. Millions, Wyatt, for specimens like this bull. Money that could save more land, more species, than all our government grants combined." "You're talking about the black market," Jed said, disbelief coloring his voice. "Selling to private collectors?" Lucas didn't deny it. "I'm talking about pragmatism. About making the hard choices when conventional methods fail." A sick feeling settled in my stomach as pieces clicked into place. Rumors of rare animals disappearing from preserves across the state, valuable specimens vanishing without explanation. How many of those had been Lucas's work? "How long?" I asked, the question scraping my throat. "How long have you been doing this?" "Long enough to know it works," he answered, which wasn't really an answer at all. There's a particular kind of heartbreak that comes with discovering someone you respect has betrayed everything they claim to stand for. It's like watching a mighty oak you've sheltered under for years suddenly topple, roots rotted through though the trunk still looked strong. "Lucas," I said, fighting to keep my voice from breaking, "it's not too late to stop this. Whatever you've done before, we can figure it out. But if you pull that trigger, there's no coming back." For just a moment, I thought I saw hesitation. Then Thunder let out a low bellow, drawing Lucas's attention. The bull's eyes were fixed on him, almost accusatory, as if he understood exactly what was happening. "That animal is more valuable dead than alive at this point," Lucas said coldly. "The buyer only needs certain parts. Step aside, Wyatt. I don't want to hurt any of you, but I will if I have to." I believed him. That was the worst part. I knew Lucas well enough to know he meant every word. He'd made his calculations, weighed lives in the balance, and somehow justified this betrayal to himself. Behind me, I could feel the rescue team tensing, ready to act. Thunder was almost ready for extraction, the lift bags creating enough buoyancy that his massive body was shifting in the mud. But any sudden movement might trigger Lucas to fire. You taught me that every living thing in this swamp has value, I said, stalling for time. That our job was to protect the balance, not decide what lives and what dies. I taught you many things, Lucas replied, but the most important lesson was one you never seemed to grasp, that sometimes good men have to make ugly choices. He raised the rifle slightly, aiming just above my head, a warning shot meant to scatter us. In that moment, something moved at the edge of my vision, a flash of diamond pattern, lightning quick. Lucas saw it too late. The eastern diamondback struck his ankle with the speed and force of a bullwhip, fangs sinking deep through his canvas pants. He cried out, the rifle discharging harmlessly into the canopy as he staggered back. More snakes were moving now, forming a protective ring around us and Thunder, their rattles creating a bone-chilling symphony. Lucas stumbled, already feeling the venom's effects as he desperately tried to take aim again. "Don't do it!" I shouted, but he wasn't listening anymore. What happened next still haunts my dreams. Lucas fired wildly, the bullet striking one of the lift bags. The explosion of compressed air sent mud and water flying as Thunder roared in panic. In the chaos, Lucas lost his footing entirely, falling backward into a section of marsh that looked solid but wasn't, a sinkhole that had been waiting silently, patiently for years. The swamp took him in seconds. One moment he was there, the next he was gone, the dark water closing over him like he'd never existed at all. I lunged forward, reaching for him on instinct, but Mason grabbed me from behind. "It's too late," he said grimly. "That's a bottomless pit, Wyatt. You go in after him. We lose you both." I knew he was right. I'd seen sinkholes swallow men before. But knowing didn't make the helplessness any easier to bear, watching my mentor, my friend, disappear before I could save him or even understand why he'd fallen so far. That's my confession, you see. Not that I killed Lucas Dawson. The swamp did that, or maybe his own choices did. My sin was that even as I watched him sink, part of me felt relief. Relief that the choice had been taken from my hands, that I wouldn't have to decide between the man who'd been like a second father and the principles he himself had taught me. For 30 years I've wondered, if that snake hadn't struck, if the swamp hadn't claimed him, what would I have done? Would I have stepped aside and let him kill Thunder? Would I have rushed him, risking my life and the lives of my team? There's no clean answer, and that uncertainty has been my penance. But this isn't the end of the story, not by half. Because what we discovered after Lucas was gone would change everything we thought we knew about Thunder, about Redemption Swamp, and about the true nature of what we were up against. Time has a peculiar way of slowing down in moments of crisis. After Lucas disappeared beneath the dark water, we stood frozen for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only seconds. The snakes had drawn back, their rattles quieting as if their mission was accomplished. Thunder let out a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the cypress trees. It was Ellie who broke the spell, her voice trembling but determined. "We need to focus on Thunder. He's still trapped, and he's fading." She was right. Whatever had just happened with Lucas, whatever betrayal we were still trying to process, our priority had to be the animal we'd come to save. I pulled myself together, pushing aside the image of Lucas's final moments. "Mason, what's the status on the lift bags?" Mason blinked, coming back to himself. "The first 2 are still holding. We lost the third, but we might have enough buoyancy if we can get the ropes under him." We returned to our rescue operation with a mechanical focus, none of us ready to discuss what we'd witnessed. Jed kept a wary eye on the snakes, which had retreated to their perimeter position but hadn't left. The junior rangers looked shell-shocked, but followed orders with silent efficiency. After 20 grueling minutes, we had the pulley system in place. Thunder seemed to understand what we were attempting, remaining unnaturally still as we worked around him. When everything was ready, we all took positions on the ropes. "On my count," I called. "1, 2, 3. Our combined strength, aided by the lift bag's buoyancy, slowly began to free Thunder from the mud's grasp. The suction fought us, like the swamp itself was reluctant to surrender its prize. Thunder grunted with pain but didn't struggle, those intelligent eyes fixed on me with what I could only interpret as trust. With a great sucking sound, he finally broke free. The sudden release sent us all sprawling backward, but Thunder was up in an instant, mud cascading from his massive frame as he found solid footing on the platform we'd constructed. For a moment he stood there, magnificent despite the mud caking his silver-gray coat, his massive chest heaving with exhaustion. Then, to our astonishment, he stepped carefully off the platform and approached me where I lay in the mud. Thunder lowered his great head until we were eye to eye, his breath warm on my face. Up close, I could see flecks of gold in his dark eyes, an unusual feature I'd never noticed before. There was something in that gaze, an intelligence, a presence, that went beyond animal instinct. "Well, I'll be damned," Mason whispered from somewhere behind me. Thunder held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned and moved a few paces away, stopping to look back at us expectantly. "I think he wants us to follow him," Ellie said, already gathering her medical supplies. It seemed impossible, but so did a circle of venomous snakes protecting a bull or a respected conservationist turning poacher. We were well beyond the boundaries of the ordinary now. "Should we?" Jed asked, eyeing the snakes, which were now moving in the same direction Thunder was indicating. I made a decision. Yes. But first, I waded carefully to where Lucas had disappeared. The surface was calm now, giving no indication of the tragedy beneath. I removed my hat and stood silent for a moment, paying respect to the man I had known, not the one he had become. Then I marked the location with GPS. We would have to report this, would have to recover him if possible. "Let's go," I said, replacing my hat. "But stay alert. Nothing about this day is normal." Thunder led us along a narrow ridge of solid ground that I'd never noticed in all my years patrolling the swamp. The snakes moved alongside us, keeping their distance but clearly traveling the same path. We followed in tense silence for about half a mile, pushing deeper into a section of Redemption Swamp that was rarely patrolled due to its inaccessibility. "Wyatt," Mason called from behind me, his voice odd. "Take a look at Thunder's tracks." I glanced down at the impressions the bull's hooves were leaving in the soft ground. What I saw made me stop short. The tracks were unnaturally precise, each hoof placed exactly where the ground was most solid, avoiding hidden sinkholes and quicksand patches that were indistinguishable to the human eye. "That's not possible," Jed muttered, kneeling to examine the tracks. No animal could know the terrain this perfectly. But Thunder did, and he was leading us through a deadly maze with the confidence of one who had traveled it many times before. After another 15 minutes, the path widened and the trees thinned. We emerged into a clearing I never knew existed, a raised island of solid ground about an acre in size. What we saw there stopped us in our tracks. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated structure, the remains of an old hunting cabin that might have been built 50 years ago. Around it, grazing peacefully, was a small herd of cattle, not ordinary cattle, but more Brahman bulls and cows, all with the same unusual silver-gray coloring as Thunder. "I don't understand," Ellie whispered. "These animals aren't native. They shouldn't be here, and they certainly shouldn't be thriving in a swamp environment." Thunder approached the herd, which gathered around him in what looked remarkably like a greeting. A smaller bull, perhaps his offspring, butted its head affectionately against Thunder's flank. "This is incredible," I said, taking in the scene. "How long has this herd been here without anyone knowing?" "That's not the only question," Mason added, pointing toward the cabin. Look." The door of the cabin was ajar, and even from a distance we could see that someone had been using it recently. There was a generator outside, partially hidden under a tarp, and what looked like modern equipment visible through the doorway. "I think we just found out why Lucas was so interested in thunder," I said grimly. We approached the cabin cautiously, the wonder of discovering the hidden herd tempered by unease about what we might find inside. The interior was a single room, sparsely furnished with a cot, a desk, and shelves lined with equipment. A battery-powered lamp hung from a rafter, and a laptop computer sat on the desk alongside ledgers and files. "This is a research station," Ellie said, examining the equipment. "Blood sampling supplies, genetic testing kits, tracking devices." Jed was looking through one of the ledgers. "These are records of the herd, lineage, health metrics, behavioral observations, going back at least 5 years. My attention was drawn to a map pinned to the wall. It showed Redemption Swamp, but with markings and notations I'd never seen on any official map. Certain areas were circled in red, others in blue, with handwritten notes in the margins. "These are territories," I realized aloud. "Not just for the cattle, but for the snake populations too." Mason joined me at the map. "And look at these dates. This research was going on while Lucas was still conservation director." The truth was beginning to take shape in my mind, but it was Ellie's gasp that confirmed my suspicions. She had opened a file on the laptop. "You need to see this," she said, her voice unsteady. We gathered around the screen. The file contained photos of Thunder and the other Brahman cattle, along with detailed genetic analyses. But it was the conclusion of the report that made my blood run cold. Preliminary DNA sequencing confirms specimen Thunder carries genetic markers consistent with Bos taurus primigenius, extinct European aurochs. Crossbreeding program with selected Brahman stock has produced viable offspring with 78% aurochs genetic recovery. Current herd represents the most successful recovery of aurochs genetics in the world. "Aurochs?" Jed frowned. "Weren't those the ancestors of modern cattle, extinct for centuries?" Ellie nodded slowly. "The last one died in Poland in the 1600s. They were massive, powerful animals. The bulls could reach 7 feet at the shoulder. They've been the holy grail of de-extinction research for decades." I remembered Lucas's words. "That bull is worth more than you know." He hadn't been exaggerating. If Thunder and his herd carried recoverable aurochs genetics, they would be priceless to certain collectors and research institutions. "So Lucas was running a secret breeding program," Mason said, looking out the window at the peaceful herd. "But why hide it? This could have been legitimate research." The answer came as I flipped through another file on the desk. Correspondence between Lucas and various private collectors and organizations. Some were legitimate conservation groups, but others had names I recognized from wildlife trafficking bulletins. "He started legitimately," I said, scanning the letters. "But somewhere along the line he began selling genetic material to private buyers. The money was funding his research, but it was also going into offshore accounts." The pieces were falling into place. Lucas's bitter comments about failed conservation, his willingness to kill to protect his secret, the elaborate security measures including the trained snakes. This had been his life's work, but somewhere along the way, his methods had become as twisted as his motives. "There's something else," Ellie said quietly, pointing to another file on the computer. "Records of behavioral conditioning experiments. He was training the snakes, Wyatt, using scent markers and reward systems to create protective behaviors around the cattle." I thought of the eastern diamondbacks forming their protective ring around Thunder, of how they had struck Lucas at the critical moment. Not coincidence, conditioning. "That's why the snakes protected Thunder from Lucas," Jed said, understanding dawning on his face. "The conditioning backfired. They identified Lucas as a threat to the animal they'd been trained to protect." The irony was almost too much to bear. Lucas had been undone by his own methods, his secret research turning against him in the end. As we stood there processing these revelations, Thunder's deep bellow sounded from outside. I moved to the doorway and saw him standing at the edge of the clearing, looking back toward the path we had come from. The snakes were agitated, rattles sounding a warning chorus. "Someone's coming," I said, instinctively reaching for my sidearm. Before any of us could move, Sheriff Hank Buchanan emerged from the tree line, followed by 2 deputies. They froze at the sight of the snakes and cattle, hands moving to their weapons. "Hold your fire!" I shouted, stepping out with my hands raised. "The snakes won't attack unless provoked." Hank's weathered face registered shock, then relief at seeing us. "Wyatt, what in God's name is going on here? Dispatch said something about a trapped bull and a poacher." I took a deep breath. How could I possibly explain everything that had happened? The hidden herd, Lucas's betrayal and death, the extraordinary genetic discovery we'd stumbled upon. It was too much to process, let alone communicate. "Hank," I said finally, "you'd better come see for yourself. We've found something that's going to change everything we thought we knew about Redemption Swamp." Explaining everything to Sheriff Buchanan took over an hour. We sat on fallen logs outside the cabin while Thunder and his herd grazed peacefully nearby, the snakes having retreated to the perimeter of the clearing as if standing guard. The whole scene had an unreal quality to it, like something from a fever dream. "Let me get this straight," Hank said, removing his hat to wipe sweat from his brow. "Lucas Dawson, the same Lucas Dawson who got the governor's conservation medal 3 years ago, was running an illegal breeding operation, tried to kill you all, and then got swallowed by a sinkhole?" "That about sums it up," I replied, feeling the inadequacy of the words even as I spoke them. Hank shook his head. "Known Lucas 30 years, had dinner at his house last Christmas. Martha made her sweet potato casserole." His voice trailed off as he struggled to reconcile the man he knew with what we'd discovered. I understood his disbelief all too well. Even with the evidence right in front of us, it was hard to accept that Lucas, mentor, friend, conservation hero, had fallen so far from the principles he'd once embodied. While Hank radioed for additional support and a recovery team for Lucas, I found myself drawn back to a memory from 15 years earlier. Lucas and I had been tracking reports of a Florida panther sighting deep in the swamp's western section. We'd been out for 2 days, sleeping rough and moving quietly through terrain few people ever saw. "Conservation isn't just about the animals, Wyatt," he'd said as we sat by a small fire that second night. "It's about preserving possibilities. Every species that goes extinct takes with it futures we can't even imagine." I'd nodded, warming my hands by the flames. "The problem is," he'd continued, his face serious in the firelight, "most people can't see beyond their own lifetimes. They can't grasp what's at stake. Sometimes I think about what I'd do if I could actually save a species, bring something back from the edge. What lines would I be willing to cross? At the time, I'd thought it was just philosophical musing. Now I understood it had been the first hint of the path he would eventually take." Ellie emerged from the cabin, interrupting my thoughts. She'd been examining Lucas's research files more thoroughly while we briefed the sheriff. "The breeding program started 8 years ago," she said, joining us. "According to his notes, Lucas discovered Thunder by accident during a routine patrol. The bull had escaped from a bankrupt specialty breeding farm where they'd been experimenting with imported Brahman genetics." "I remember that place," Mason said. "The Hendricks operation. Went under during the recession, about the time those weird cattle disease rumors were circulating." Ellie nodded. Lucas recognized something unusual in Thunder's appearance and behavior. He secretly captured a blood sample and had it tested by a private lab. When the results showed aurochs, genetic markers, he began his project. "So he hid Thunder and started breeding him with regular Brahman cows?" Jed asked. At first, Ellie confirmed, but the real breakthrough came 3 years in, when he located two female Brahmins with similar genetic markers. That's when the program really accelerated. I glanced at the herd. There were 12 animals in total: thunder, 3 adult females, 2 younger bulls, and 6 calves of various ages. Each carried the distinctive silver-gray coloring and impressive stature of their patriarch. His scientific methodology was actually quite sound, Ellie continued, sounding reluctantly impressed. The genetic recovery percentages increased with each generation. The younger bulls are nearly 80% genetically identical to pure aurochs, which made them incredibly valuable, Mason added. To the right buyers, yes, Ellie agreed. His correspondence shows initial contact with legitimate research institutions, but they all wanted public disclosure and peer review. When he started getting offers from private collectors, things changed. I could almost trace Lucas's moral decline through what we were learning. The initial scientific curiosity, the secrecy justified by fear of interference, the first compromise in accepting private funding, and then the final collapse into outright trafficking and violence. "What about the snakes?" Jed asked. "That behavioral conditioning is unlike anything I've ever heard of." Ellie shook her head in amazement. Lucas was apparently experimenting with scent markers and reward systems. He discovered that eastern diamondbacks could be trained to associate the cattle's specific scent with food rewards and certain human scents with threats. "But they turned on him," I said. "His notes indicate the conditioning was becoming unstable in recent months." The snakes were forming stronger associations with the cattle themselves than with the reward system. It's almost like they developed a genuine protective instinct. I remembered Thunder's intelligent gaze, the way he had led us unerringly to this hidden clearing. Was it possible Lucas had underestimated the very animals he was studying? Had they formed bonds beyond his scientific understanding? The sound of approaching helicopters cut through the humid air. Hank's backup was arriving, along with state officials who would take control of the scene. Our discovery was too significant, too unprecedented, to remain our responsibility alone. "What happens to them now?" I asked, nodding toward Thunder and his herd. "That'll be above my pay grade," Hank replied honestly. "But I reckon once word gets out about what they are, they'll be the most protected cattle in America." He was right, of course. The scientific value of the herd was incalculable. But I couldn't help feeling a pang of concern for Thunder, who had already endured so much. Would he simply become another research subject, his remarkable intelligence and spirit reduced to genetic data points? As the first helicopter appeared overhead, Thunder raised his massive head to watch, seemingly unperturbed by the noise. His calm confidence steadied something in me. Whatever happened next, he had survived. His legacy was secure in the herd that grazed around him. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. State wildlife officials, forensic teams, and eventually federal agents descended on the clearing. Statements were taken, evidence cataloged, and plans made for the herd's temporary care. A recovery team began the grim task of searching for Lucas's body in the sinkhole where he'd disappeared. Through it all, I found my thoughts returning to Lucas, not the man who had threatened us with a rifle, but the mentor who had shaped my understanding of conservation in the natural world. How had someone with such profound respect for nature ended up betraying its most fundamental principles? By late afternoon, I was sitting alone on a fallen log at the edge of the clearing, watching as Thunder and his herd were carefully herded into specially designed transport trailers. They would be moved to a secure facility for evaluation and protection. The bull went willingly, as if understanding the necessity, though he paused once to look back at me. "Quite a day, huh?" I turned to find Ellie standing behind me, her face showing the same mixture of exhaustion and wonder that I felt. "I keep thinking I'll wake up," I admitted as she sat beside me. "I know what you mean," she said softly. But it's the parts that feel like a nightmare I keep wishing weren't real. We sat in companionable silence for a moment, watching the activity around us. The first stars were appearing in the eastern sky as the sun began its descent behind us. "Did you see the file labeled Thunder Cognitive Testing?" Ellie asked eventually. I shook my head. Lucas was documenting intelligence tests he conducted with Thunder. Maze navigation, object permanence, even rudimentary tool use. She paused. "Wyatt, the results were off the charts. Not just for cattle, for any non-primate species." "You think that's connected to the aurochs' genetics?" "Maybe. Or maybe Lucas just found an exceptional animal and recognized something special in him." She looked toward the transport trailers. "Either way, I've requested to be part of the research team that works with the herd going forward. I want to make sure they're treated as more than just walking genetic libraries." I nodded, grateful for her commitment. "Lucas told me once that every animal has a story, if we're patient enough to learn their language. I didn't fully understand what he meant until today." "He wasn't wrong about everything," Ellie said gently. "No," I agreed. "Just about what mattered most in the end." As darkness settled over Redemption Swamp, I found myself thinking about the contradictions that had defined Lucas Dawson. The conservationist who became a poacher, the scientist who resorted to violence, the mentor who betrayed his own principles. Perhaps we all contain such contradictions, just waiting for the right circumstances to bring them to the surface. 3 days later, after the initial frenzy had subsided and the investigation was fully underway, I returned to the spot where Thunder had been trapped. The swamp had already begun reclaiming the evidence of our rescue operation, mud filling in the deep hoof prints, water covering the disturbed ground. Standing there in the heavy stillness, surrounded by the ancient cypress trees that had witnessed it all, I tried to make peace with what had happened. The recovery team had found Lucas's body the previous day, trapped in an underwater cavity created by the tangled roots of a fallen tree. He would be buried in the Oakwood Cemetery next to his wife Mabel, who had passed 5 years earlier. Whatever judgment awaited him beyond this life was not mine to determine. As for Thunder and his herd, they were now the subject of international scientific interest. The genetic recovery of aurochs traits was being hailed as a breakthrough in conservation biology. Teams of researchers were poring over Lucas's notes, trying to understand both his methods and his results. I had given my final statement to the investigators that morning, recounting every detail of that fateful day. But there were some things I kept to myself. The look in Thunder's eyes when he led us to his herd, the way the snakes had seemed to make a decision to protect rather than attack. The feeling that had settled over me in that hidden clearing that we were witnessing something beyond scientific explanation. Some stories belonged to the swamp alone, passed like whispers through cypress knees and Spanish moss. The old-timers had it right when they said, "Redemption Swamp held secrets." Some of those secrets had come to light, but others remained hidden in its dark waters and shifting grounds, waiting for those who knew how to listen. As I turned to leave, a movement caught my eye, the distinctive diamond pattern of an eastern diamondback sliding silently through the underbrush. The snake paused, its unblinking eyes meeting mine for a brief moment before it continued on its way, disappearing into the heart of the swamp that had claimed both Lucas's life and his legacy. In that moment, I understood something that would stay with me for the next 30 years. In Redemption Swamp, as in life, nothing was ever as simple as it first appeared. The lines between predator and protector, between savior and destroyer, were as shifting and unpredictable as the swamp itself. And Thunder? He had shown us that sometimes the most profound wisdom comes from those we least expect to teach us. A lesson I would carry with me through the decades that followed, shaping my life in ways I never could have imagined on that summer day when a bull, a snake, and a betrayal changed everything. The weeks following our discovery in Redemption Swamp passed in a whirlwind of activity. Federal investigators combed through Lucas's records, scientific teams evaluated Thunder's herd, and journalists circled like vultures, hungry for details of the sensational story. Through it all, I kept my head down and did my job, patrolling the areas of the swamp that had always been my responsibility, trying to find my way back to some semblance of normalcy. But normalcy proved elusive. The swamp itself seemed changed, or perhaps it was just my perception of it. Paths I'd walked 1,000 times felt unfamiliar. Shadows seemed deeper, and every rustle in the underbrush made me tense with memories of that day. Lucas's funeral was held on a sweltering August afternoon. Despite everything, I felt obligated to attend. The small church in Oakwood was packed, not with mourners genuinely grieving Lucas, but with curiosity seekers and reporters hoping to catch a glimpse of those involved in the scandal that had rocked the conservation community. I sat in the back, hat in hand, listening as the preacher spoke of forgiveness and redemption. He hadn't known Lucas, not really. None of the people filling those pews knew the man I had, the Lucas who could identify 30 bird species by their calls alone, who taught me how to track a deer through cypress stands, whose weathered hands had pulled me from quicksand when I was 23 and too foolish to heed his warnings about the western marsh. After the service, I slipped out before anyone could corner me for comments. I drove not home to Maggie, but back to the preserve, drawn by something I couldn't name. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the service road as I made my way to the administrative building where Lucas had once had his office. The space had been thoroughly searched by investigators, but now sat empty, a layer of dust already settling on the desk where Lucas had written countless reports defending the swamp against development, pollution, and neglect. On the wall hung a faded photograph. Lucas, accepting the governor's conservation medal, his weathered face solemn but proud. I stared at it, trying to reconcile that man with the one who had pointed a rifle at me in the marsh. "Thought I might find you here." I turned to find Sheriff Hank Buchanan standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Just saying goodbye, I suppose," I replied. Hank nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Federal boys are wrapping up. They've taken all his research, computers, everything. Place'll probably stay empty until they hire a new director. Any word on what will happen to Thunder and the herd? Being moved to some special research facility up in Tennessee next week. Real hush-hush operation." He paused. "They're saying Lucas had contacts in at least 3 countries. Collectors willing to pay millions for genetic material from those bulls." I shook my head, still unable to fully comprehend the scope of Lucas's betrayal. "Did they find any accomplices? Someone must have been helping him." Hank's expression darkened. "That's actually why I came looking for you, Wyatt. They found emails, encrypted ones, between Lucas and someone else in the preserve, someone who was helping him manage the herd when he couldn't be there." A cold feeling settled in my stomach. "Who?" "They don't know yet. Code names only. But they're looking hard at everyone who worked closely with Lucas." The implication was clear. I had been Lucas's protégé, his trusted right hand for years. In the eyes of investigators, that made me a prime suspect. "I had nothing to do with it, Hank. You know that." "I know," he said quietly. "But they don't know you like I do. And they're finding things, Wyatt. Things that don't look good." "What things?" He hesitated. "Payments to an offshore account, trail rides through sections of the swamp where the herd was hidden, supplies requisitioned that can't be accounted for." Each point hit like a physical blow. I hadn't done any of it, but I could see how it looked from the outside, could see the narrative they were constructing with Lucas dead and unable to confirm or deny anything. "They're coming tomorrow with more questions," Hank continued. "I thought you should know. Give you time to prepare." I understood what he wasn't saying. time to get my story straight, time to consult a lawyer, time to prepare my family for what might be coming. The weight of it settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. "Thanks, Hank." He lingered in the doorway, clearly wanting to say more, but unsure how to proceed. Finally, he asked, "Was there ever a time, Wyatt, when you suspected, even just a feeling that something wasn't right with Lucas?" The question pierced straight to the heart of what had been troubling me since that day in the swamp. Had there been signs? Had I missed them, or worse, ignored them because of my loyalty to the man? "There were moments," I admitted slowly. Comments he made about conventional conservation failing, bitterness about budget cuts and political interference, but nothing that pointed to this. Hank nodded, accepting my answer without judgment. "Get some rest. Tomorrow's going to be a long day." After he left, I remained in Lucas's office as twilight settled outside the windows. From somewhere in the swamp came the low, mournful call of a bull alligator, a sound as ancient and primeval as the land itself. It reminded me of thunder's deep bellows, and I wondered if he was calling out tonight in whatever sterile facility they were keeping him. When I finally left, the stars were out in force, scattered across the dark canvas of the sky like diamond dust. I drove home with the windows down, letting the warm night air wash over me, carrying the scents of pine and water and growing things. Maggie was waiting on the porch, a glass of sweet tea in her hand and concern in her eyes. She'd been my rock through all of this, never questioning my integrity even as the investigation cast its shadow over our lives. "Hank found you?" she asked as I climbed the steps. "He did?" I sank into the chair beside her, suddenly bone-weary. "They think I might have been involved, Maggie." She reached over and took my hand, her grip firm and reassuring. "Then they don't know you at all." We sat in silence for a while, listening to the chorus of cicadas and watching heat lightning flash on the distant horizon. Finally, I voiced the thought that had been haunting me. What if I could have stopped him? If I'd paid more attention, noticed the changes in him? "You can't take that on yourself," Maggie said firmly. "Lucas made his choices. Whatever led him down that path, it wasn't your responsibility to prevent it." I wanted to believe her, but doubt had taken root, growing like the invasive vines that choked the cypress trees in the western marsh. Sleep eluded me that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling fan as it turned lazy circles above our bed, my mind replaying every interaction with Lucas over the past few years, searching for clues I might have missed. Around 3 in the morning, I gave up trying to sleep. I slipped out of bed, careful not to wake Maggie, and went to the small home office where I kept my field journals. For 25 years, I'd maintained the habit Lucas himself had instilled in me, recording observations, tracking patterns in the swamp, noting changes in animal behavior and water levels. I pulled out the journals from the past 5 years and began reading, looking for anything that might help me understand when and how Lucas had changed. The familiar rhythm of my own words was soothing, grounding me in the work that had defined my life. Then, in an entry from 3 years ago, something caught my eye. I'd written about an unusual track pattern near the eastern marsh, signs that multiple large animals had been moved through an area not typically used as a game trail. At the time, I'd theorized it might be feral hogs, but now I recognized it for what it must have been: Thunder's herd being relocated. What troubled me was the note I'd added, mention to LD. He suggested focusing patrol efforts elsewhere due to budget constraints. Lucas had deliberately steered me away from the area, and I, trusting his judgment implicitly, had complied without question. How many other times had he manipulated me, used my trust and respect to keep me from discovering his secret operation? The thought made me sick to my stomach. By dawn, I had filled pages with notes, connecting dots that had previously seemed unrelated. A pattern emerged of subtle redirections, of Lucas finding reasons to handle certain areas of the preserve himself, of supplies and equipment that went missing with plausible but convenient explanations. When Maggie found me, bleary-eyed and surrounded by journals, I could only look up at her with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. "He used me," I said simply. "All these years he was using my trust to protect his operation." Maggie looked over my notes, her expression growing more troubled with each page. "You need to take this to the investigators," she said finally. "Show them you were in the dark, that Lucas was deliberately keeping you away from what he was doing." She was right, of course. These journals might be my best defense against the suspicion falling on me. But as I gathered them up, a new, more troubling thought emerged. If Lucas had been this calculating, this careful to cover his tracks and manipulate those closest to him, what else might he have done? What other measures might he have taken to protect his secret? The answer came later that day during my interview with the federal investigators. They were thorough and professional, neither accusatory nor sympathetic as they walked me through a timeline of Lucas's activities. I presented my journals, explaining the pattern I discovered of being subtly directed away from Lucas's secret areas. The lead investigator, a serious woman named Agent Callahan, reviewed my notes carefully. "This is helpful, Mr. Calloway, but there's still the matter of the financial transactions." "I know nothing about any offshore accounts," I said firmly. "We believe you," she replied, surprising me. "Because the account wasn't in your name. It was in your wife's maiden name, Margaret Lynn Sullivan." The room seemed to tilt around me. "That's impossible. Maggie would never—" "We don't believe your wife was knowingly involved," Agent Callahan interrupted. "The account was set up using her information but accessed only through encrypted connections from Lucas Dawson's devices. We believe he was setting up a contingency plan, evidence that would implicate you and your wife if he was ever discovered." The full, horrible genius of it hit me then. Lucas had created a fail-safe. If he went down, I would go down with him. He'd known that my reputation for integrity would make me dangerous if I ever discovered his operation, so he'd manufactured evidence to destroy that credibility if necessary. "He was my friend," I said, the words hollow in my mouth. "I trusted him with my life." Agent Callahan's expression softened slightly. "People like Lucas Dawson are expert manipulators, Mr. Calloway. They use trust as a weapon. Based on our investigation so far, we don't believe you were knowingly involved in his activities." Relief washed through me, but it was short-lived. "However," she continued, "we do need your help with one more thing. We believe there's additional evidence, possibly records of other buyers or accomplices, hidden somewhere in the swamp. Given your knowledge of the terrain and Lucas's patterns, you might be able to help us locate it." I agreed without hesitation. If Lucas had other partners, other people involved in exploiting Thunder and his herd, I wanted them found and held accountable. The next morning I led a team of agents to areas of the swamp where Lucas had most frequently directed me away from. We searched all day without success, the July heat baking us as we slogged through mud and water. By late afternoon, even the determined federal agents were flagging, their city stamina no match for the swamp's punishing conditions. As we prepared to head back, something nagged at the edge of my consciousness, a memory trying to surface. Lucas and I fishing on Cooter's Creek, years ago. Him pointing out an old moonshiner's cabin, half collapsed but still standing on a small rise above the floodplain. "One more place," I told the weary agents. "About a mile northeast of here." The old cabin was just as I remembered it, weathered gray boards leaning precariously, roof partially caved in. It looked abandoned, untouched for decades, which was precisely why it made a perfect hiding place. "Lucas showed me this place 15 years ago," I explained as we approached. "Said it was the last remnant of the bootlegging days, when moonshiners used the swamp to hide from revenuers." The inside was a single room, empty except for the collapsed remains of a table and chair. Dust covered everything, undisturbed. The agents looked at me skeptically. "Check the floor," I suggested, remembering another detail from that long-ago day. Moonshiners always had hiding places for when the law came calling. Sure enough, beneath a rotting bearskin rug we found a trapdoor, and beneath that a waterproof case containing a laptop, external hard drives, and paper records, Lucas's insurance policy, but not against discovery as we'd thought, against his buyers. The files revealed the full scope of Lucas's operation. He hadn't just been selling to private collectors, he'd been documenting their illegal purchases, gathering evidence against some of the most powerful people in the underground wildlife trade. It was all there: names, dates, amounts, even recorded conversations. "He was playing both sides," Agent Callahan said wonderingly as she examined the files. "Selling to these people while building a case against them." I sat on the cabin's sagging porch steps, trying to process this final twist. Had Lucas seen himself as some kind of vigilante, infiltrating the very networks he was supposedly fighting? Or had he simply been hedging his bets, ensuring he had leverage if his buyers ever turned on him? Whatever his motives, the evidence he'd gathered would dismantle trafficking networks across 3 continents. The very people who had funded his secret research would be brought down by it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the swamp, I found myself thinking again of Thunder, the magnificent bull who had unwittingly been at the center of all this intrigue. Had he somehow sensed Lucas's dual nature? Was that why he had trusted me, led me to the hidden herd, despite years of conditioning to remain hidden? I would probably never know. But as we made our way back through the gathering darkness, the familiar sounds and scents of the swamp surrounding us, I felt something I hadn't expected, a measure of peace. Not forgiveness for Lucas, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. The swamp had always been a place of contradictions: beauty and danger, life and death, preservation and decay, all existing in perfect balance. Perhaps Lucas, in his own twisted way, had embodied those same contradictions. The mentor who taught me to respect nature's wisdom had also exploited its rarest treasures. The friend who had shaped my career had also betrayed my trust in the most fundamental way. And yet, in the end, his actions would help protect creatures like Thunder from those who would exploit them. It wasn't redemption. Nothing could erase the lines he had crossed. But it was something. A final, complicated legacy for a man whose life had become as tangled and impenetrable as the swamp he had claimed to protect. Fall came to Redemption Swamp with subtle changes, the light shifting to a more golden hue, the water level rising with seasonal rains, migratory birds beginning their journeys south. The federal investigation had concluded, leading to arrests across 3 continents of collectors and traffickers implicated by Lucas's hidden files. My name had been fully cleared, though the shadow of suspicion had cost me something intangible, a certainty about my place in the world that I wasn't sure I'd ever recover. Through it all, I kept working, finding solace in the familiar rhythms of the swamp. But a piece of me remained back in that clearing, with Thunder and his remarkable herd. I received occasional updates from Ellie, who had indeed secured a position with the research team studying the bulls. The scientific community was abuzz with the implications of the aurochs genetics, with papers being published and conferences convened to discuss the findings. It was Ellie who called me on a crisp October morning, her voice tight with excitement and something else, urgency, perhaps. "You need to come to the Tennessee facility," she said without preamble. "It's Thunder." My heart sank. "Is he sick?" "No, nothing like that. He's just not thriving, Wyatt. None of them are. They're physically healthy, but they're showing signs of distress, refusing food, displaying stereotypic behaviors. The younger ones are adapting. But Thunder," she hesitated, "he's giving up." I closed my eyes, seeing in my mind the magnificent bull who had led us through the swamp with such purpose and intelligence. The thought of him confined, studied, separated from the environment he had mastered was almost physically painful. "What can I do?" I asked, though I already knew why she was calling. "They respect you. The research director, Dr. Harmon, has seen the footage of Thunder leading you to the herd. He thinks you might be able to help us understand what they need." I looked out my office window at the swamp stretching to the horizon. I had responsibilities here, patrols to complete, reports to file. But Thunder had a claim on me, too, one that went beyond explanation. "I'll be there tomorrow," I said. The research facility was nothing like I had imagined. Rather than sterile laboratories, it was a sprawling ranch in the Tennessee hills with vast pastures enclosed by high fences. Modern buildings dotted the property, but they had been designed to blend with the landscape, all wood and stone and earth tones. Dr. James Harmon, the research director, met me at the main gate, a tall, austere man with a shock of white hair and penetrating blue eyes. He had the weathered look of someone who spent more time outdoors than in, which immediately raised him in my estimation. "Ranger Calloway," he greeted me, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming, Dr. Whitman speaks very highly of you." Ellie appeared from one of the buildings, smiling in greeting. She looked different here, more formal in khakis and a polo shirt with the research center's logo. Her usually wild curls tamed into a ponytail, but the sparkle in her eyes was the same. "Where is he?" I asked after the pleasantries were exchanged. "The north pasture," Dr. Harmon replied. "We've given Thunder and his immediate family group a separate enclosure. The younger bulls are in the east section." We drove in a utility vehicle across the property, passing state-of-the-art barns and monitoring stations. The place was impressive, clearly well-funded and thoughtfully designed. But it wasn't the swamp. The north pasture was a beautiful piece of land, rolling hills, a clear stream cutting through one corner, shade trees scattered in natural-looking groupings. Under different circumstances, it would have seemed idyllic. And there was Thunder, standing motionless under an oak tree, his massive frame silhouetted against the autumn sky. Even from a distance, I could see the change in him. The proud set of his head was gone, his powerful shoulders slumped. 3 Brahman cows grazed nearby, seemingly less affected, but Thunder himself was not eating, not moving, just staring into the distance toward the south. "He's been like this for weeks," Ellie said softly. "We've tried everything, different foods, environmental enrichment, even introduced new cows thinking he might respond to potential mates. Nothing works." "He's looking toward Florida," I said, recognizing the direction of his gaze. "Toward home." Dr. Harmon frowned. "That's anthropomorphizing Ranger Calloway. Bulls don't have concepts like home." I bit back a sharp response. This man hadn't seen what I had, hadn't witnessed Thunder's uncanny intelligence, his ability to navigate the deadly swamp terrain, his apparent decision to lead us to his hidden herd. "Let me talk to him," I said instead, alone. Dr. Harmon looked skeptical but nodded. "We'll observe from the monitoring station. Take this if you need to call for assistance." He handed me a radio before retreating with Ellie to a small building at the edge of the pasture. I approached Thunder slowly, talking softly as I came. "Hey, big fella. Remember me? Been a while." At the sound of my voice, Thunder's head turned. For a moment, There was no reaction. Then a flicker of something, recognition, perhaps, sparked in those dark eyes. He took a step toward me, then another. I kept talking, nonsense mostly, just letting him get used to my voice again. When I was about 20 feet away, I stopped, not wanting to crowd him. Thunder closed the remaining distance himself, his movements stiff but purposeful. When he reached me, he lowered his great head, bringing those intelligent eyes level with mine. I saw in them not just recognition, but something that looked remarkably like relief, as if he had been waiting, hoping that someone from his old life would appear. "They're treating you well here," I said, reaching out slowly to touch his broad forehead. "But it's not the same, is it? Not like the swamp." Thunder exhaled heavily, his breath warm on my hand. Up close I could see that his coat had lost some of its luster, and though he wasn't thin, he had lost muscle mass from his reduced activity. "I'm sorry," I said quietly. "I don't know how to fix this." For nearly an hour I stood with Thunder, sometimes talking, sometimes in companionable silence. Gradually, he seemed to relax, even moving to graze a little as long as I remained nearby. The cows approached as well, less wary than they had been in the wild, but still maintaining a respectful distance. When I finally returned to the monitoring station, Dr. Harmon was watching Thunder with newfound interest. "That's the most animation we've seen from him in weeks," he admitted. "You clearly have a rapport with him." "It's not me," I said. "It's what I represent. The swamp. Freedom." Ellie nodded, a shadow crossing her face. "I've been saying the same thing, James. These animals spent generations adapting to a very specific environment. This place is beautiful, but it's not what they know. We can't exactly recreate a Florida swamp in Tennessee," Dr. Harmon said, though his tone was thoughtful rather than dismissive. "No," I agreed. "But maybe you don't have to." Over dinner that evening, the three of us discussed possibilities. The research facility had been chosen for its security and controlled environment, essential for studying animals of such scientific value. But what if there was a way to balance that scientific necessity with the bulls' evident need for their native habitat? "The eastern section of Redemption Swamp could be secured," I suggested. "It's already naturally isolated by water on 3 sides. With proper fencing and monitoring on the 4th side, it could become a controlled research area." Dr. Harmon looked skeptical. The logistics would be challenging, not to mention the cost. "But the research potential would be extraordinary," Ellie countered. "Observing these animals in their adapted environment rather than an artificial one. Think of what we could learn about behavioral patterns, social structures, habitat utilization." The conversation continued late into the night. Ideas building upon ideas. By morning, Dr. Harmon had warmed to the concept enough to make some calls. The foundation funding his research was interested, very interested, in the potential of an in situ study area. It would be unprecedented, combining conservation, research, and habitat preservation in a new model that could set standards for similar projects worldwide. It would take months to set up, he cautioned, and there would be hurdles, permits, environmental impact studies, security concerns. "But it could work," Ellie pressed. Dr. Harmon nodded slowly. "It could. In the meantime, though, we still have the immediate problem of Thunder's declining condition." I had been thinking about that all night. "Let me take him back," I said suddenly. "Just Thunder as a test case. If he responds well to being back in the swamp, it strengthens the argument for relocating the entire herd." "That's an enormous risk," Dr. Harmon objected. "He's irreplaceable from a genetic standpoint." "He's irreplaceable, period," I said firmly. "And he's dying here, Dr. Harmon. Not physically, but in every way that matters." The debate raged for days, involving not just Dr. Harmon but the Foundation Board, state wildlife officials from both Tennessee and Florida, and a team of veterinary experts. In the end, what tipped the scales was Thunder himself, his continued decline despite my presence, and new blood work showing stress hormones at dangerous levels. 2 weeks after my arrival in Tennessee, I found myself accompanying a specially designed transport trailer back to Florida, Thunder secured safely inside. Dr. Harmon and Ellie followed in a second vehicle with monitoring equipment and a portable veterinary setup. We had secured temporary permits for a 90-day trial with strict conditions about security and data collection. The journey took 2 days, with frequent stops to check on Thunder and ensure his comfort. As we crossed the Florida state line, I swear I felt a change in the trailer, a shift in energy, as if Thunder somehow sensed he was returning to familiar territory. When we finally reached Redemption Swamp, the autumn sun was setting, painting the cypress trees in hues of gold and amber. We had selected a holding area near the edge of the eastern marsh, close enough to Thunder's original territory to be familiar, but accessible enough for the research team to maintain their monitoring equipment. As the trailer doors opened and Thunder stepped onto Florida soil for the first time in months, the change was immediate and dramatic. His head came up, nostrils flaring as he drank in the scents of the swamp. His powerful frame seemed to expand, muscles tensing with renewed energy. "My God," Dr. Harmon breathed, watching the transformation. "It's like he's a different animal." Thunder took a few cautious steps, then more confident ones, exploring the holding pen with growing animation. When he reached the side facing the deeper swamp, he stopped, lifting his head to gaze out at the wilderness beyond the fence. The sound he made then, a deep, resonant bellow that carried across the water, raised goosebumps on my arms. It was a call I had never heard from him before, containing notes of both longing and triumph. From somewhere in the distance, impossibly, came an answering call, another bull, wild and free in the heart of the swamp. "That's not possible," Dr. Harmon said, checking his records frantically. "We relocated all the identified members of the herd." Ellie and I exchanged glances. "Maybe Lucas didn't find them all," she suggested. "Or maybe some broke away from the main herd at some point." Whatever the explanation, the effect on Thunder was electric. He paced the fence line, calling again and again, receiving answers each time from the unseen bull in the distance. That night, as we set up our monitoring equipment and temporary camp, the swamp came alive around us with its nocturnal symphony. Frogs, insects, the occasional splash of something entering or leaving the water. Thunder remained alert and engaged, showing none of the lethargy that had characterized his time in Tennessee. "I've never seen anything like it," Dr. Harmon admitted as we sat around a small campfire. "The environmental triggers must be incredibly powerful to elicit such an immediate response." "It's more than that," I said, watching Thunder's silhouette against the starlit sky. "This is where he belongs, where he's meant to be." Dr. Harmon looked thoughtful. "Perhaps our approach to conservation has been too clinical. We preserve genetic material, maintain population numbers, protect habitats in the abstract, but we don't always consider the spiritual component, for lack of a better term." "The soul of the animal," Ellie suggested quietly. "Yes," he agreed, surprising me, "the essence that makes it more than just a collection of genes and behaviors." Over the next days, Thunder's improvement accelerated. He began eating voraciously, regained muscle tone, and exhibited none of the stereotypic behaviors that had worried the researchers in Tennessee. The blood work confirmed what we could see with our own eyes: stress hormones plummeting, health markers improving across the board. But the most remarkable development came on the 5th day. The mysterious bull that had been calling from the swamp appeared at the edge of the clearing, a younger Brahmin with the same distinctive silver-gray coloring as Thunder, though not quite as massive. It watched us warily from the tree line, never approaching the camp, but clearly drawn by Thunder's presence. "It must be one of his offspring that escaped capture," Ellie theorized. "But how did it survive alone all this time?" The answer came gradually, as more cattle began to appear in the following days. 3 cows, another young bull, even a calf on spindly legs. All bore the markers of Thunder's bloodline, but none matched the records of the captured herd. "There's another herd," Dr. Harmon realized with growing excitement. "A second, completely undocumented group with the same genetic markers." The implications were staggering. Not only had Lucas's breeding program been more successful than anyone realized, but some of the animals had established themselves independently in the swamp, adapting and thriving without human intervention. And something else began happening, something none of us had anticipated. Snakes started appearing near our camp. Not in threatening numbers, but individual eastern diamondbacks that would emerge from the underbrush, observe for a while, then retreat. They never approached aggressively, never rattled warnings. They simply watched, as if assessing our intentions. Lucas's conditioning, Ellie guessed. It must have spread somehow through the snake population. Whatever the explanation, their presence added another layer of complexity to an already extraordinary situation. The swamp was revealing secrets none of us had imagined, challenging our assumptions about wildlife behavior, adaptation, and the interconnectedness of seemingly disparate species. By the time our 90-day permit was nearing its end, the evidence was overwhelming. Thunder had not just recovered. He had thrived, reconnecting with the wild herd through the fence line, regaining his vigor and spirit. The research data was compelling enough that the Foundation had already approved funding for the permanent research preserve within Redemption Swamp, with construction of more sophisticated but unobtrusive monitoring facilities underway. The only question that remained was whether to reintegrate Thunder with the wild herd or bring the rest of his captive family from Tennessee to join him in the controlled research area. The scientific argument favored keeping him separate, where his health and behavior could be closely monitored. But watching him interact with his wild kin through the fence, I knew what needed to happen. On the final day of our permit, as dawn broke over the cypress trees, we gathered to make the decision that would determine Thunder's future. Dr. Harmon had flown in members of the Foundation Board, along with state wildlife officials and even a federal representative. The stakes were high, not just for Thunder, but for the entire approach to conservation his case represented. I stood at the fence line, watching Thunder as he gazed out at the swamp where members of the wild herd were visible in the morning mist. His posture was alert, powerful, vibrating with barely contained energy. This was no longer the defeated animal I had found in Tennessee. When my turn came to speak to the assembled officials, I kept it simple. Thunder has shown us something extraordinary, not just about cattle genetics or behavioral adaptation, but about the essential connection between an animal and its home. We can protect him, study him, learn from him, but we can't own his spirit. Dr. Harmon nodded, his initial skepticism long since replaced by a deep respect for what we had witnessed. Our recommendation is to release Thunder to join the wild herd, while maintaining the research preserve as a protected area for observation. The remaining captive herd will be relocated here from Tennessee, but housed in a separate section for controlled study. There were questions, concerns, debates about scientific methodology and conservation priorities, but in the end, the evidence before their eyes was too compelling to ignore. Thunder had made his own case more eloquently than any human advocate could have. As the officials departed to finalize the paperwork, I stood alone with Ellie and Dr. Harmon at the gate that separated Thunder from the wilderness. Are we doing the right thing? Dr. Harmon asked quietly. From a purely scientific perspective? I think we're doing the necessary thing, Ellie replied. Sometimes the best science means recognizing when to step back and observe rather than control. I said nothing, my attention fixed on Thunder. He had moved to the gate, standing motionless, as if he understood what was about to happen. Those intelligent eyes met mine one last time, and in them I saw something I had no scientific language for, a recognition, an understanding, perhaps even a kind of forgiveness for how long it had taken us to hear what he had been telling us all along. When we opened the gate, Thunder didn't bolt immediately as I had expected. He stepped through deliberately, paused to look back at us, then moved with unhurried dignity toward the wild herd waiting at the edge of the clearing. As he joined them, the younger bull approached, touching noses with Thunder in what looked remarkably like a greeting between family members long separated. Then, as one, the herd turned and moved into the deeper swamp, disappearing into the wilderness that had sheltered them, challenged them, and ultimately recognized them as its own. "We'll still be able to track him," Dr. Harmon said, gesturing to the unobtrusive monitoring collar Thunder wore. "Study his movements, his interactions with the wild herd." For a while, I agreed, but I suspected the swamp would once again keep its secrets. Technology, like humanity itself, could only peer so far into its mysteries. As we packed up our temporary camp, a movement caught my eye. A large eastern diamondback emerging from the underbrush, its distinctive pattern gleaming in the afternoon sun. It paused, regarding me with unblinking eyes, then turned to follow the path the cattle had taken into the swamp. Protector, predator, or something else entirely, the roles we assigned to the creatures of Redemption Swamp had never quite contained their reality. In the end, perhaps that was Lucas's final lesson, delivered in a way he had never intended. True conservation meant preserving not just species or habitats, but the complex, often inexplicable relationships that bound them together. As I watched the snake disappear into the sawgrass, I felt a chapter closing, not just on Thunder's story or Lucas's betrayal, but on a certain way of seeing the world. Whatever came next, for the swamp and for those of us who had witnessed its mysteries, would be written in a new language, one that acknowledged how much we still had to learn from the wild places and creatures we sought to protect. 30 years is a long time to carry a story inside you. Memories weather like cypress wood, the sharp edges soften, colors fade, but the core grows stronger. I'm 72 now, my ranger days long behind me, but Redemption Swamp has never left me. Some places mark you forever, like a brand on your soul. The wooden rocking chair creaks beneath me as I shift my weight, easing the ache in my right knee. An old injury from a fall during my final year as a ranger. The porch of my little cabin overlooks a slice of the swamp I purchased 15 years ago. Just 10 acres, but it's enough to keep me connected to the water and woods that shape my life. "That's why the eastern diamondbacks protected Thunder?" Sarah asks, leaning forward in her chair. "Because our grandfather trained them somehow?" I look at the young woman, 26, with Lucas's determined chin and clear blue eyes. Beside her sits her brother Thomas, 2 years younger, but with the same intense focus. Lucas Dawson's grandchildren come seeking answers about a man they barely remember. "It was more complicated than training," I reply, choosing my words carefully. "Your grandfather discovered something about the relationship between certain species in the swamp, connections that science still doesn't fully understand. The snakes recognized Thunder and his herd as part of their ecosystem in a way that went beyond normal wildlife interactions." "But he was still poaching," Thomas says, the word heavy with disappointment. "Selling to private collectors." "Yes and no," I say, watching a great blue heron rise from the water's edge, wings spread against the evening sky. Lucas crossed lines he shouldn't have crossed, made compromises that became corruptions. But he was also gathering evidence against those same collectors, building cases that eventually brought down trafficking networks across 3 continents. Sarah shakes her head, struggling with the contradictions. Mom always said he was a complicated man. That he was, I agree. Brilliant, passionate, and deeply flawed. He believed the ends justified the means, that he could do wrong things in service of right outcomes. It's a dangerous path. Is that why you wanted to meet us here? Thomas asks. To explain why he died? To defend him? I take a slow breath, feeling the weight of 3 decades pressing on my chest. No, son. I wanted you to know the whole truth, not just the fragments you've gathered over the years. Your grandfather wasn't a saint, but he wasn't simply a villain either. And what happened in the swamp that day changed conservation in ways nobody could have predicted. And it had. The Redemption Swamp Research Preserve became a model for conservation worldwide, a protected space where animals could be studied in their natural habitat with minimal human interference. Thunder's story had challenged fundamental assumptions about wildlife behavior, interspecies relationships, and the ethical boundaries of conservation. What happened to Thunder? Sarah asks, her voice softening. After you released him back into the wild? I smile at the memory. He thrived, led the wild herd for another 7 years. The tracking collar showed them ranging throughout the eastern swamp, gradually expanding their territory. They developed patterns unlike any domestic cattle, seasonal migrations between grazing areas, complex social structures, remarkable adaptations to the swamp environment. And the genetics? Did they really have aurochs DNA? I nod. They did. Not enough to call them true aurochs, but enough to make them unique, a living link to a species lost centuries ago. The scientific papers are still being written, theories still being debated. But one thing's certain, your grandfather discovered something extraordinary, even if his methods were sometimes questionable. Thomas runs a hand through his hair, a gesture so like Lucas's that it creates an echo across time. Did he ever express regret? At the end? The question pierces me unexpectedly. Lucas's final moments, his face as the swamp pulled him under, have haunted me for 30 years. Not because I could have saved him, but because I'll never know if he understood the consequences of his choices. I don't know, I answer honestly. It happened too fast, but I like to think he did. That in those final moments he recognized how far he'd strayed from the principles that once guided him. We sit in silence for a while, watching twilight settle over the swamp. Cicadas begin their evening chorus, joined by the deep thrumming of bullfrogs. A hint of rain hangs in the air, promising a summer storm before morning. There's something else, I say finally. Something I've never told anyone outside the original research team. Sarah and Thomas exchange glances, leaning forward slightly. About 5 years after Thunder was released, the tracking collar stopped transmitting. Dr. Harmon organized a search, worried that Thunder had died or been injured. We spent days following his last known movements, eventually tracking him to a remote area in the deepest part of the swamp. I pause, remembering that day with perfect clarity. The humid air, the dappled sunlight through the cypress canopy, the sense of entering a place few humans had ever seen. We found the collar, I continue. Removed, not broken or fallen off. Deliberately removed. It had been placed in the hollow of a cypress tree, the clasp carefully undone. That's impossible, Thomas says, brow furrowed. A bull couldn't— I know, I interrupt gently. That's what Dr. Harmon said. But there it was, and nearby we found fresh tracks, not just from cattle, but from eastern diamondbacks following the same path. It was the last confirmed sighting of Thunder or his wild herd. What are you saying? Sarah asks, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm saying the swamp keeps its secrets, that sometimes science can't explain everything we observe, that your grandfather, for all his flaws, glimpsed something profound about the relationships between species, something that went beyond conventional understanding. The skepticism in Thomas's expression reminds me so much of Lucas in his more cynical moments that it almost makes me smile. You think the snakes helped a bull remove his tracking collar? I think, I say carefully, that Redemption Swamp taught me humility, taught me that the natural world is more complex, more interconnected than we can fully comprehend, and that the most important thing we can do as conservationists is recognize the limits of our understanding. A rumble of thunder sounds in the distance, and the first fat raindrops begin to patter on the cabin's tin roof. Sarah wraps her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, but makes no move to go inside. "Is that why you brought us here tonight?" she asks. "To tell us about thunder?" "Partly," I admit, "but also because I owed it to your grandfather to make sure you knew the whole story, his failures and his achievements. Lucas made terrible mistakes, but his work also led to the protection of Redemption Swamp and the species within it. That's a complicated legacy, but it's yours to carry forward if you choose." Thomas's expression softens. "Mom said you two were like brothers once." "We were," I say, feeling the old grief rise up fresh as yesterday. For most of my life, he was the man I admired most in this world. Even now, after everything, I can't bring myself to hate him. I've spent 30 years trying to understand him instead. "And have you?" Sarah asks. "Understood him?" I consider the question as the rain picks up, creating a silver curtain around the porch. Not entirely, but I've made my peace with not understanding, with accepting that good people can do terrible things and flawed people can leave behind legacies worth preserving. Lightning flashes across the swamp, briefly illuminating the landscape in stark white light. In that flash, I catch a glimpse of something at the edge of the water, a large form, silvery gray, watching the cabin from beneath a cypress tree. Then darkness returns, and it's gone, if it was ever there at all. "There's one more thing," I say, reaching beneath my chair for the weathered leather satchel I'd placed there earlier. "Something your grandfather would want you to have." I hand the satchel to Sarah, who opens it carefully. Inside is a bound journal, Lucas's original field notes from his first observations of thunder, handwritten in his precise, slanting script. "This is where it all began," I explain. "Before the compromises, before the lines were crossed, when it was just a man encountering something extraordinary and wanting to understand it. The Lucas Dawson I knew, the real Lucas, is in those pages." Sarah runs her fingers over the cover, then looks up at me with tears in her eyes. "Thank you. I should have given it to your mother years ago," I admit. "But some truths take time to age properly, like good bourbon." Thomas smiles at that. "Mom said you always had a way with words." "Your grandfather was the poet between us," I reply. I just call things as I see them. As the storm settles into a steady downpour, we move inside to the small living room. Over coffee and pecan pie, Maggie's recipe, though she's been gone 3 years now, I tell them more stories. The Lucas before the betrayal, the man who taught me to read the swamp like a book, who could identify bird calls with his eyes closed, who once swam through alligator-infested waters to rescue a fawn stranded by flooding. He sounds different from the grandfather we heard about growing up, Thomas says, setting down his empty cup. He was many things, I reply, as we all are. The mistake is thinking people are simple, that they can be reduced to just their best or worst actions. By the time the rain stops, it's past midnight. Sarah and Thomas prepare to leave, promising to return soon with their mother, Lucas's only daughter, who hasn't visited the swamp since her father's funeral. At the door, Sarah hesitates. Do you think, do you think Thunder is still out there somewhere? Or his descendants? I look past her to the swamp, now quiet and mysterious under the clearing sky, stars beginning to peek through gaps in the clouds. I believe some part of him is, I say, whether in his bloodline or in the memory of the swamp itself. Some things don't end, they just change form. After they've gone, their rental car's headlights fading down the long dirt drive, I return to the porch. My old bones protest as I lower myself back into the rocking chair, but I'm not ready for sleep just yet. The swamp is different at night, more alive with sound and shadow, less willing to reveal its secrets. From somewhere deep within comes a low, rumbling bellow, likely a bull alligator, though to my old ranger's ears it carries echoes of Thunder's distinctive call. "Still out there, aren't you, old friend?" I murmur to the darkness. "Still keeping your secrets?" Whether I mean Thunder or Lucas, I couldn't rightly say. Perhaps both. Perhaps neither. 30 years is a long time to carry questions without answers, but sitting here on the edge of Redemption Swamp, where I've spent most of my life learning its rhythms and respecting its mysteries, I find I no longer need those answers. The beauty of the natural world isn't in its explanations, but in its endless capacity to surprise us, challenge us, humble us. That was Lucas's final gift to me, though he never intended it. The understanding that true wisdom begins when we accept how little we truly know. The swamp taught me patience. It taught me to listen more than speak. And it taught me that redemption comes in many forms, not all of them clean or easy to recognize. As I rock gently in the night air, my thoughts drift to Thunder, not the scientific marvel with his ancient genetics, but the magnificent bull who looked me in the eye that day in the marsh, who led us to his hidden herd, who somehow knew which paths through the deadly swamp would bear his weight. "We did right by you in the end," I whisper. "Took us long enough, but we got there." A night bird calls from nearby, its voice plaintive and haunting. Somewhere an owl answers. The conversation of the swamp continues, as it has for centuries before us, and will for centuries after. I close my eyes, feeling a peace that's been 30 years in the making. Tomorrow, I'll take my morning coffee on this porch and watch the sun rise over the cypress trees. I'll look for the great blue heron that fishes near my dock, and maybe catch a glimpse of the otter family that denned up under the boat shed last spring. And perhaps, if I'm very quiet and very lucky, I might see something silver-gray moving through the morning mist, a descendant of Thunder's line, carrying forward the legacy of a remarkable bull who taught us all what it truly means to belong to a place, to be shaped by it and shape it in return. That's the thing about Redemption Swamp. It asks hard questions. It demands respect. But for those willing to listen, really listen, it also offers something rare and precious in this rushed world, the chance to be part of a story bigger than ourselves, a story that began long before we arrived and will continue long after we're gone. And in the end, isn't that what we all want? Not just to be remembered, but to have been part of something enduring, something true. Dear friends, as we journey through our golden years, Wyatt's story reminds us that life's most profound wisdom often comes through our deepest struggles. Like Thunder finding his way home, we too seek connection to what truly matters. Remember when you first discovered your passion, that job, hobby, or place in nature that spoke to your soul? Perhaps like Wyatt, you've witnessed relationships change over decades, seen betrayal transform into understanding, and learned that forgiveness isn't just for others but also for ourselves. The beauty of our age is the perspective it grants us, seeing the full circle of life's complexities and still choosing hope. Just as Redemption's swamp held secrets and surprises, Our lives continue to unfold with unexpected gifts if we remain open to them. What place has shaped your life, like the swamp shaped Wyatt's? Have you, like thunder, ever found yourself called back to somewhere that feels like home after time away? Share your story in the comments below. Our collective wisdom grows stronger when we connect through the experiences that have molded us into who we are today.